Wade Holloway didn't pull the woman closer because of the storm. He did it after hearing what she whispered in the dark. Rain slammed against the barn roof while Rosalie's fingers twisted tight in Wade's coat. His lantern swung from a rusty hook, throwing gold light across the horses behind them. Somewhere outside, wagon wheels crushed through wet snow toward the ranch. Wade lowered his head near her ear and said something that made her stop breathing for a second. What he promised that night would follow them both long after the storm passed. Would you have stayed or walked away? Rain hammered the roofs of Cedar Ridge, hard enough to drown out the piano inside the Silver Spur saloon. Mud ran thick through the street, wagon wheels carving deep tracks beneath the lantern glow. The smell of wet horses and whiskey drifted through the storm. Rosalie Bennett kept her head down as she hurried past the side alley, with a bundle of folded shirts pressed against her chest beneath her coat. Water dripped from the edge of her bonnet onto her sleeves. The laundry house closed an hour ago, but Mrs. Doyle still expected the Mercer linens cleaned by morning. A voice cut through the rain. Well now, there she is. Rosalie stopped walking. Clyde Mercer stood beneath the awning beside the saloon door, cigar glowing red between his fingers. Two drunk ranch hands leaned near him, laughing softly to themselves. Clyde's dark coat looked untouched by the weather, expensive boots clean despite the mud. You still owe me for that room over on Birch Lane, he said. Seems rude to disappear without paying a man. Rosalie tightened her grip on the shirts. I told you already. I'll pay the balance after next week. You've said that 3 weeks running. One of the men snorted. Clyde stepped down from the boardwalk into the rain. You can settle it another way. Rosalie took a step back immediately. The movement made Clyde smile. There's a warm bed waiting, he said. No woman should be alone in weather like this. Her stomach turned. The rain blew harder between them. Somewhere nearby, a horse kicked against wood inside the stable. I'm going home, she said quietly. Clyde caught her wrist before she could move. Not rough, not yet, but enough. Rosalie's breath caught. She looked down at his hand gripping her sleeve. Then she looked back up at him. Let go. Clyde leaned closer. Whiskey clung to his breath. You ought to be grateful anybody in this town still bothers with you. The ranch hands laughed again. Rosalie jerked free, so suddenly the folded shirts fell into the mud. Before Clyde could grab her again, she turned and ran into the alley behind the saloon. Boot steps splashed behind her. Rosalie. She didn't look back. Rain blinded her as she pushed through in the darkness between buildings. Her boots slipped across wet planks near the livery stable. Lantern light shook across puddles. Horses whinnied nervously from inside their stalls. The creek bridge appeared ahead through the storm. Too fast, her foot hit slick wood, then nothing. The world snapped sideways. Cold water slammed into her like stone. For one terrible second, she couldn't breathe. The current dragged her beneath the narrow bridge while rain exploded against the creek surface overhead. Her fingers clawed against rocks. Her shoulder struck something hard. Then darkness rolled in. Far beyond town, Wade Holloway rode with his collar turned against the storm, pushing 3 stray horses back toward the ranch. Snow mixed with rain now, sharp against his face. His gelding suddenly stopped near the creek crossing. Wade frowned. The horse wouldn't move, then he saw it, a dark shape against the bank below. He dismounted instantly, boots splashing into icy water. By the time he reached her, Rosalie's hair clung across her face and her hands were blue from cold. Damn it, he muttered. He lifted her carefully from the creek. She barely stirred. Wade recognized her then. Rosalie Bennett, the woman from the laundry house near Miller Street. Quiet, kept to herself, always looking over her shoulder like trouble might already be walking behind her. Thunder rolled across the prairie. Wade glanced once toward town. He already knew what people would say if he brought her home. He picked her up anyway. The cabin sat alone beneath the hills north of Cedar Ridge, lantern light flickering weak against the storm. By the time Wade carried her inside, snow had started sticking along the porch rail. He laid her carefully beside the stove and fed more wood into the fire. Rosalie woke sometime later to the sound of wind pushing against the cabin walls. For a moment, she didn't move. The ceiling above her was rough pine. Firelight flickered orange across the room. Somewhere nearby, coffee simmered low over heat. Then she saw the revolver resting on the table beside the bed, not pointed at her, just there. Clean, loaded, close enough to reach. A warning. Or protection. Maybe both. Rosalie slowly sat up beneath heavy wool blankets. Her dress hung drying near the stove. Someone had wrapped another quilt around her shoulders while she slept. The cabin smelled like cedar smoke, leather, and cold air. Bootsteps crossed the floor. She looked up fast. Wade Holloway stood near the doorway, pulling on thick gloves. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark coat still damp from snow. A scar cut faint across his jaw, beneath several days of beard. His eyes settled on her only briefly. "You were near frozen when I found you." Rosalie pulled the blanket tighter. "I should go. You can't. I can walk." Wade opened the front door halfway. Snow swirled violently through the opening. The first winter storm of the season had covered the prairie white. He shut the door again. "You'll die before you make town." Silence settled between them. The fire cracked softly. Rosalie noticed another mug sitting untouched near the stove. He must have made coffee for her. Wade grabbed his hat from the wall. "Cattle fence broke west of the ridge," he said. "Need to check it before morning." Rosalie watched him carefully. Men in Cedar Ridge usually talked too much when they were alone with women. Wade barely looked at her at all. Before leaving, he crossed the room once more and pulled the blanket higher around her shoulders, rough hands surprisingly careful. Then finally he said it. "Nobody's putting their hands on you again." The words stayed in the room after he stepped into the storm. Rosalie stared at the closed door for a long moment. Then her eyes drifted toward the shelf beside the stove. A framed newspaper clipping sat there beneath a lantern. 3 years old, the edges yellowed with age. Her breath slowed as she read the headline. "Local rancher breaks Mercer's arm during saloon fight below." It stood a younger Wade Holloway beside Sheriff Nolan Pike, blood on his knuckles and fury in his eyes. The article mentioned a frightened saloon girl, Clyde Mercer, had cornered upstairs before Wade intervened. Rosalie looked toward the snow-covered door again. Outside, the storm swallowed the prairie whole. The cabin creaked softly beneath the wind. Somewhere far out in the dark, a loose gate banged against wood in slow, uneven rhythm. She barely slept. Every few minutes, she found herself listening for footsteps, for drunken voices, for Clyde Mercer pushing through the door with that cold smile of his. But only the storm came. Near dawn, Wade returned. Rosalie heard the scrape of boots outside first. Then, the heavy sound of snow falling from a coat. The front door opened, letting in a burst of white wind and bitter cold. Wade stepped inside, carrying a lantern and smelling of wet leather and horses. He stopped when he saw her awake. For a second, neither spoke. Then he crossed quietly to the stove and poured black coffee into a tin cup. "You should drink something warm," he said. Rosalie hesitated before taking it. The coffee tasted burnt and bitter, but the heat steadied her hands. Wade pulled off his gloves. Fresh snow clung to his dark hair near his temples. "You got family in town?" he asked. "No. Anywhere else?" She shook her head once. That seemed to end the conversation for him. He moved around the cabin in silence, feeding wood into the stove, checking the latch on the window near the wash basin. Everything about him felt careful, measured. Rosalie watched him from beneath the blanket. Most men filled quiet spaces by talking. Wade Holloway seemed built from quiet itself. By noon, the storm still hadn't broken. Rosalie insisted on helping despite the ache in her shoulder. She found a stack of torn ranch coats near the back room, beside a crate of horseshoes and harness oil. You can leave those, Wade said, from the table where he was sorting feed receipts. I've mended worse. He looked like he wanted to argue. Instead, he slid a sewing tin across the table toward her. The afternoon settled into a strange kind of peace. Wind rattled the windows. Coffee simmered low. Rosalie sat near the stove stitching ripped sleeves while Wade worked through ranch numbers, with a pencil worn nearly to the nub. Occasionally, he rubbed his hand across tired eyes before returning to the ledger. At sunset, a knock came at the door. A skinny boy stood outside, wrapped in an oversized coat. Tommy Reed. Snow covered his boots nearly to the knees. "Mr. Holloway," he said, stepping inside carefully. Fence held on the north ridge. Then his eyes found Rosalie. The boy straightened awkwardly and pulled off his hat. "Ma'am." Rosalie offered the faintest smile. Tommy carried in a sack of oats and nearly slipped on melting snow by the doorway. Wade caught the bag before it hit the floor. "You'll break your neck running in weather like this," Wade muttered. Tommy grinned anyway. Rosalie noticed something then. The boy looked at Wade, the way lonely boys look at men they hope might stay. That evening she cooked stew, mostly because the silence had started bothering her more than the work. Wade watched quietly as she moved around the small kitchen corner, sleeves rolled slightly past her wrists. "You always cook?" he asked. "When there's food worth cooking." One side of his mouth almost moved. Almost. They ate at the small wooden table while snow drifted past the windows outside. Halfway through supper, Wade stood suddenly and grabbed his plate before she could touch it. "I can wash my own dishes." Rosalie blinked once. "I wasn't saying you couldn't." He looked strangely uncomfortable after that. Later she found out why. The man truly lived alone. No woman's touch anywhere in the cabin. No framed photographs. No curtains except feed sackcloth over the bedroom window. One chair near the stove had been repaired so many times the legs no longer matched. But sometime before bed she noticed something else. The broken rocker beside the fireplace no longer leaned sideways. Wade must have fixed it while she cooked. He said nothing about it. Just like he said nothing when she left a folded towel near the wash basin before turning in for the night. The days slipped slowly after that. Rosalie stayed because the roads remained buried under snow, and because Wade never once made her feel cornered. Still, distance lived between them. She noticed how he dropped muddy boots near the door instead of on the mat. He noticed how she thanked him for every small thing, like she expected kindness to expire without warning. One bitter night, the wind tore through Cedar Ridge, hard enough to kill the lantern flame. Darkness swallowed the cabin instantly. Rosalie froze. Her breathing changed first, then her hands. The room vanished around her. The cold, the dark, the smell of damp wood. Suddenly she was 12 again, locked inside a storage shed behind a boarding house while grown voices laughed outside the door. "Rosalie?" Wade's voice sounded far away. She backed against the wall without realizing it. A chair scraped. Then warm hands caught her shoulders gently. "Hey," Wade said quietly. "You're all right." But she wasn't. The darkness pressed too close. Before she knew it, her hands had twisted into the front of his shirt. Wade pulled her against him without hesitation. His coat smelled like cedar smoke and snow. "It's just the storm," he murmured near her hair. "Nothing's getting in here." Rosalie trembled hard enough he could feel it. Still, he didn't let go. Minutes passed like that beside the dead lantern, while the wind screamed outside the cabin walls. Eventually, her breathing slowed. Wade loosened his arms carefully, giving her room to move away. She didn't. Not right away. The next morning, sunlight finally broke across the prairie in pale gold. Tommy arrived before breakfast carrying feed invoices tucked beneath his arm. While Wade saddled a horse outside, the boy leaned closer to Rosalie near the stove. "You know," he whispered. "Before you came here, Mr. Holloway was fixing to sell the ranch." Rosalie looked up sharply. Tommy nodded toward the window. "He already packed half the barn last month." Outside, Wade stood alone beside the fence line, snow blowing around his boots while he tightened the saddle strap with rough, steady hands. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Rosalie wondered what could make a man walk away from the only home he had left. Winter settled hard over Cedar Ridge after that. Snow packed along the wagon roads until horses struggled through the drifts. The creek behind Wade's cabin froze thick around the edges. Most mornings began with the crack of splitting wood and the smell of coffee warming on the stove before sunrise. Without speaking about it, Rosalie slowly became part of the ranch's rhythm. She mended gloves for the ranch hands at night beneath the oil lamp. She kept careful account of feed sacks and oats in Wade's old ledger book, after noticing he skipped numbers whenever he got tired. Sometimes she swept snow from the porch before he woke. Wade noticed every bit of it. He just never said much. One cold morning she found a new pair of wool-lined boots beside her bedroom door. No note, no explanation, only her exact size. At supper that evening she glanced toward him across the table. "You didn't have to buy these." Wade kept eating without looking up. Road to town freezes near the ridge this time of year. That was all. Still, Rosalie wore the boots every day after that. The first real trouble started in town. Mrs. Doyle sent Rosalie to collect thread and lamp oil from the general store near Main Street. Wade offered to go instead. Rosalie refused before he even finished asking. "I know how to walk into town alone," she said quietly. He studied her a moment, then nodded once. But when she stepped inside Talbot's Mercantile later that afternoon, conversation shifted almost immediately. Women near the fabric counter lowered their voices without lowering them enough. "That's her. She's staying out at Holloway's ranch. I heard she hasn't left there in weeks." Rosalie kept her eyes on the bolts of cloth while measuring black thread between her fingers. Then another voice came softer. "Men don't marry women like her, they hide them." A few uneasy laughs followed. Rosalie stood completely still. The clerk avoided looking at her while wrapping the oil bottles in newspaper. Outside, snow melted slow beneath weak sunlight. Wagons creaked past the church road. Somewhere across town, someone hammered fresh boards onto the feed store roof before the next storm arrived. Rosalie walked home with the paper parcel, pressed tightly against her chest. By the time Wade returned from the north pasture that evening, her small suitcase sat beside the front door. He stopped inside the entryway, snow dusting his shoulders. For a moment, neither moved. Then Wade's eyes settled on the suitcase. "What's this?" Rosalie folded a shirt carefully before answering. "Roads should clear by tomorrow." "That ain't what I asked." She kept folding. "I've stayed long enough." Wade shut the door harder than necessary. Wind rattled the windows. "Because of town gossip?" he asked. "It isn't gossip if everybody believes it." Something sharp crossed his face then. Not anger exactly. Something closer to hurt. "You're leaving because folks talk too much." "I'm leaving because they are right." That got his attention. Rosalie finally looked at him. "You think they'll ever see me as anything except trouble following you around?" Wade took a step forward. "I don't give a damn what they see." "Well, I do." Silence crashed between them. The fire snapped loudly in the stove. Wade pulled off his gloves slowly. "So that's it? You pack your things and disappear?" Rosalie's voice thinned despite herself. "People always leave once the town starts talking." The words landed harder than she intended. Wade stared at her, really stared, and suddenly he understood something terrible. She wasn't preparing to leave because she wanted to. She was preparing because, somewhere deep down, she already expected to be left behind first. Outside, rain began hitting the roof, melting fresh snow into slush. Rosalie grabbed her coat and stepped toward the barn before the tears gathering in her eyes could betray her. Wade followed. The barn smelled of hay, horses, and cold rain blowing through loose boards near the roofline. Lantern light swung gently above the stalls. Rosalie wiped quickly at her face. angry with herself. "You don't have to save me," she whispered. Wade stood just inside the doorway, chest rising hard beneath his coat. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Rain hammered the roof overhead. Then finally, quieter than before, he answered, "Maybe I'm trying to save myself too." Rosalie looked up. Something in Wade had broken open. No walls, no careful distance. Just exhaustion and honesty sitting plain in his eyes. A gust of cold wind swept through the barn. Rosalie shivered instantly. Without thinking, Wade crossed the space between them and pulled her against him. Warmth hit her first, then the steady beat of his heart beneath layers of denim and wool. Rosalie should have stepped back. Instead, her hands closed slowly against his coat. Wade lowered his forehead against hers. Careful, hesitant, giving her room to refuse. She didn't. The kiss came quiet at first, almost uncertain. Then, deeper, when Rosalie's fingers tightened against him like she'd finally stopped, holding herself together. Outside, rain poured across the prairie. Inside the barn, time seemed to narrow down to warmth, breath, and the rough feel of Wade's hand steady at her back. The barn door suddenly slammed open. Both of them pulled apart fast. Sheriff Nolan Pike stepped inside, shaking rain from his hat. A folded paper sat tucked beneath his arm. His eyes moved once between Wade and Rosalie before settling flat again. "Hate to interrupt," he said. Wade's jaw tightened instantly. "What is it?" Nolan handed him the document. "Clyde Mercer filed claim papers this morning." Wade unfolded the page beneath the lantern glow. Rosalie watched the color slowly drain from his face. "The debt tied to your father's land comes due in 14 days, Nolan said quietly. "If payment ain't made, Mercer takes the ranch." The rain kept falling hard against the roof while Wade stood frozen with the paper in his hand. Rosalie watched his eyes move slowly across the document. Not surprise, recognition. Like a man seeing an old wound split open again. Nolan cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mercer filed through the county office in Cheyenne last month. Judge stamped it legal yesterday morning." Wade folded the paper once, carefully. "How much?" 3,000 even. Rosalie almost drew breath at the number. For a small ranch outside Cedar Ridge, it might as well have been 30,000. Nolan shifted his hat in his hands. "I figured you ought to hear it from somebody besides Mercer." Then he glanced once toward Rosalie before stepping back into the rain. The barn door slammed shut behind him. For a long time, Wade said nothing. Only the horses shifted softly in their stalls, while rainwater dripped through the roof into old buckets near the wall. Rosalie finally spoke. "You knew about this." Wade stared down at the folded paper in his hand. "My father borrowed against the land years ago and never paid it back." A bitter smile touched his mouth for barely a second. "No, he mostly drank it away." That night the cabin felt different, smaller somehow. The fire burned low while Wade sat at the table with old receipts, ranch ledgers, and county notices spread around him beneath the oil lamp. His coffee went cold untouched. Rosalie pretended to mend a shirt nearby, though her needle barely moved. Near midnight, Wade stood suddenly and reached for his coat. "You're leaving?" she asked softly. "Need to move cattle before the North Trail freezes solid. In this weather? I'll be back tomorrow." But he came back 2 days later instead. Snow covered the shoulders of his coat when he walked through the door. His hands looked raw from the rains. One knuckle had split open and dried dark against his skin. Rosalie noticed before he could hide it. "You're hurt. It's nothing." He moved toward the stove, but she caught his wrist gently first. Wade stilled. Rosalie cleaned the cut in silence with warm water and whiskey from a small brown bottle near the shelf. Wade sat unusually still while she wrapped clean cloth around his hand. "You should've worn thicker gloves," she murmured. "Couldn't afford thicker gloves." The words came out flat, honest. Rosalie lowered her eyes after that. Over the next week, Wade barely slept. Before sunrise, he hauled freight wagons through the mountain road north of Cedar Ridge for extra pay. By afternoon, he repaired fences or broke horses for neighboring ranchers. Some nights he came home long after dark, smelling of snow and exhaustion, and slowly things inside the ranch began disappearing. First 2 saddles, then 3 head of cattle. Then the gray mare Tommy loved feeding apples to every morning. Rosalie understood what was happening before Wade admitted it. One evening she followed him quietly into the back shed near the corral. He didn't hear her at first. Wade stood beside an old wooden chest with papers spread across a crate. Deeds, sale agreements, land maps yellowed with age. At the center sat a folded document bearing his mother's signature. Rosalie felt something tighten in her chest. "You're selling her land." Wade turned sharply. For a second he looked angry she'd seen it, then only tired. "It's the last piece left. You said the north pasture belonged to your mother." It did. The lamp beside them flickered weakly in the draft. Rosalie looked at the papers again. A man doesn't sell the last thing his mother leaves behind unless desperation has already reached bone deep. 2 days later, Clyde Mercer arrived at the laundry house, while Rosalie picked up mended shirts for Mrs. Doyle. He leaned against the doorway, smiling like they were old friends. "You look tired," he said. Rosalie kept folding shirts. "What do you want?" "I came to offer peace." She almost laughed at that. Clyde stepped closer. "You leave Holloway's ranch. Come stay somewhere proper. Debt disappears." Rosalie's hands stopped moving. "You'd spare Wade's land? I'd tear up every paper myself." The room suddenly felt too warm. Clyde lowered his voice. "Holloway's drowning already. Question is whether you plan on dragging him under with you." That night, Rosalie packed after Wood fell asleep. Not much. 2 dresses, her sewing tin, the photograph of her mother she kept wrapped inside cloth at the bottom of her suitcase. She stood quietly near the front door, pulling on gloves, when a voice came from the darkness behind her. "You planning on leaving without saying goodbye this time too?" Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. Wade stood near the hallway in long underwear and boots, lantern light catching the exhaustion carved deep into his face. "I can stop this," she whispered. "Mercer said he'll clear the debt." Wade went completely still. "And what's he want in return?" Silence answered for her. Something fierce flashed across Wade's eyes then. He crossed the room fast enough her breath caught. Before Rosalie could step away, he pulled her against him, hard, arms locking around her, like he was holding together the last thing keeping him standing. "I'd lose every acre before I lose you." His voice shook against her hair. Rosalie felt her throat tighten painfully. Wade leaned back just enough to look at her. "When Clara died," he swallowed hard, "this place stopped feeling alive. I stayed because I didn't know where else to go." Rosalie stared at him quietly. Snow hissed softly against the windows. Then Wade touched her face with rough, careful fingers. "And then you walked into this house." The room fell silent except for the fire. Wade drew one uneven breath. "Marry me for real." Rosalie blinked once. "Not because you need saving," he said softly. "Because I can't imagine this place without you anymore." Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Outside, somewhere beyond the dark prairie, a horse suddenly came tearing toward the ranch at full speed. Then came Tommy Reed's frightened voice shouting through the night. "Mr. Holloway!" Wade turned instantly toward the door. Tommy nearly fell from the saddle when he reached the porch. Snow whipped around the boy's face. "Mercer's coming," he gasped. "He's bringing men with him." Wade was already reaching for his coat. How many? 4 maybe. Sheriff Pike's with them. Rosalie felt the room turn cold despite the fire. Wade grabbed the rifle hanging beside the door, then stopped halfway. Slowly, he set it back down. "No," he muttered. "That's what Mercer wants." Outside, lanterns moved through the storm far beyond the fence line. Horses, wagon wheels grinding through snow. Tommy swallowed hard. "They're almost here." Wade opened the front door. Wind burst into the cabin, sharp enough to shake the lamp flame. "Stay inside," he told Rosalie. but she followed him onto the porch anyway. The prairie stretched white beneath the moonlight, breaking through torn clouds. Mercer's wagon rolled across the frozen yard, with Sheriff Nolan Pike beside it and 2 ranch hands behind them. Clyde Mercer climbed down first, expensive boots crunching across snow. "Well," he called, "looks like I came just in time." Wade stood still at the top of the porch steps. "What do you want, Mercer?" "You already know." Sheriff Pike cleared his throat uneasily and unfolded papers from inside his coat. "County authorized immediate seizure if payment can't be guaranteed." Rosalie saw neighbors gathering near the road, despite the cold. Folks from Cedar Ridge always came when trouble smelled close enough. Mercer's eyes drifted toward Rosalie, standing beside Wade. "There she is," he said softly. "Woman nearly cost you your ranch." Wade's jaw tightened. Mercer smiled wider. "Truth is, Holloway, you were sinking before she ever stepped foot here." Rosalie felt the familiar sting of eyes watching her. Judgment, curiosity, whispered assumptions carried through winter air. Then Mercer took one step closer. "You could still walk away clean," he told her. "No reason for a stray to go down with a dying ranch." Before Rosalie could answer, Wade stepped directly in front of her. The movement happened fast. Certain. Snow blew hard across his shoulders while he faced Mercer squarely. "She ain't yours to talk about," Mer laughed once. "You planning to marry her now?" Wade didn't even hesitate. "She's my woman." His voice carried clear across the yard. "Anybody lays a hand on her answers to me first." The crowd near the road went silent. Rosalie stared at him from behind, breath caught somewhere deep in her chest. No shame in his voice, no hesitation, just truth. Mercer's smile disappeared slowly. Big words for a man losing everything by sunrise. Another wagon suddenly appeared through the storm from the south road. Wade frowned. The horses stopped beside the fence, and an older woman climbed down, wrapped in a dark wool coat. Edith Holloway. Behind her came a thin man carrying a leather case beneath his arm. Mercer's expression shifted instantly. Edith walked straight through the snow toward Wade without slowing. "Told you years ago your mother kept papers better than your father ever did," she muttered. The lawyer opened the case carefully beneath the porch lantern and removed several folded documents sealed with county stamps. Sheriff Pike took them first. His eyes narrowed while reading, then narrowed further. "What is it?" Mercer snapped. Pike looked up slowly. "The North Acreage was transferred to Wade Holloway 8 years ago." Mercer frowned. "That land backed the debt." "No," the lawyer corrected calmly. "Only Samuel Holloway's remaining cattle rights did, Mrs. Holloway separated the ranch ownership before her death." Edith crossed her arms against the cold. "Your snake was thinking nobody bothered reading the fine print." Snow hissed softly against the porch roof. Mercer grabbed the papers from Pike and scanned them himself. Color rose dark across his face. "You hid this." Edith gave a dry little laugh. "No, you just never expected a woman to outsmart you." A few men near the road chuckled under their breath. Mercer looked suddenly smaller, standing there in the snow. Pike handed the papers back stiffly. "You got no legal claim to the ranch." For one ugly second, Rosalie thought Mercer might still force something. Then he saw the town watching, saw Wade standing steady beside her, saw the fight already slipping away. Mercer shoved the papers back toward the lawyer and climbed into his wagon without another word. The wheels turned hard through snow as he disappeared into the dark prairie. Slowly, the crowd drifted apart. Lanterns faded one by one down the road toward Cedar Ridge. Only wind remained. Much later, after Tommy finally fell asleep near the stove and Edith left for her own ranch, silence settled gently through the cabin. Rosalie stood alone on the porch beneath a pale wash of moonlight across the snowfields. Wade stepped beside her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Neither spoke for a while. Coyotes cried faint, somewhere beyond the hills. Rosalie wrapped cold fingers around the tin cup. "All my life," she said quietly, "I kept waiting for people to choose something else over me. Wade looked at her, the easier road, a safer choice, somebody that fit better. She swallowed once. After a while, you stop expecting anyone to stay. The porch boards creaked softly as Wade stepped closer. From his coat pocket, he pulled a small velvet pouch worn thin at the edges. Inside rested a simple gold ring, nothing fancy, just old and carefully kept. My mother's, he said. Rosalie stared at it silently. Wade didn't kneel, didn't make some grand speech. He only looked at her the same way he had the night he pulled her from the freezing creek. Steady, certain. Stay, he said softly. That's all I want. Rosalie covered her mouth before the tears could escape, but this time they came anyway. Wade slid the ring gently onto her finger. Spring reached Cedar Ridge late the next year. Snow melted off the prairie in silver streams. Wild grass returned across the hills behind the ranch. Rosalie opened a small sewing corner beside Talbot's Mercantile downtown. Women who once whispered now brought dresses for repairs and stayed to talk longer than before. Tommy worked full-time at the ranch and followed Wade everywhere like a shadow. One warm evening near sunset, Rosalie stepped quietly into the barn and found Wade building something from fresh pine boards, a cradle. Wood shavings covered the floor around his boots. He looked up just as she crossed toward him. Rosalie took his rough hand gently and placed it against her stomach without saying a word. Wade froze completely. Then a slow, stunned laugh broke out of him, young and disbelieving all at once. Outside, prairie wind rolled soft through the tall grass. Later that night, they sat together on the porch, swing beneath the glow of the cabin lantern while darkness settled over the Wyoming hills. No contracts, no rumors. Only the home they had finally chosen together. And maybe that's the part that stays with you after the story ends. Not the storm, not the fight over the ranch, not even the night Wade stood in front of the whole town and chose Rosalie without shame. Maybe it's the quiet things. A cup of coffee waiting before sunrise, a lantern left burning in the window, a tired man building a cradle with rough hands, because, for the first time in years, he believed tomorrow belonged to him again. If you've ever spent part of your life waiting for people to leave, then you probably understand Rosalie better than most. And if you've ever loved someone enough to stay when staying was hard, then maybe there's a little of Wade Holloway in you too. Some people saved each other loudly. Others do it in silence. One small kindness at a time. That's what this story was really about. Not perfect people. Just two lonely souls who finally stopped running long enough to build a place where love could live. And somewhere out there, tonight, maybe somebody listening still needs to believe a home like that is possible. If this story stayed with you, tell us where you're listening from, or the one moment that touched your heart the most. And if you'd like, stay a while longer with us. There are still more dusty roads, old ranch houses, broken hearts, and healing stories waiting just beyond the next firelight.